in the big red book there on the altar, I think its cover page calls it something like the Presider's Ritual Edition or something like that. Ours has a few pencil marks in it. Some of the tops of the pages are ever so slightly indented with paper clips from service notes. Gentle reminders of the many, many services held in this space over time. In one of the Eucharistic prayers, though I can never remember which one, someone penciled into the usual formula about Jesus' death, resurrection, and coming again, the word life. So it reads, Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and coming again. I think I've heard a story or two about where it comes from, but coming in late to the discussion, I simply get to treasure that gem. So many of us inherit a faith that says the cross is what it's all about. Jesus' death. The whole point is the forgiveness of sins, perhaps. And while that's true, today's gospel reminds us that if all God had to do was come and die, Herod's soldiers could have handled that in the Bethlehem countryside. If all Jesus had to do was come and die, he could have died in this massacre or another somewhere else. It's just clear that the life of Jesus also matters to our salvation, to our understanding of our own lives and how we ought to live them. That just as the infant Christ and his family sought shelter, we too seek and provide shelter, are vulnerable and love the vulnerable. Now, in Matthew's story, Jesus survives the Bethlehem massacre under the shelter of his parents, under the shelter of someone's kindness in Egypt. Matthew attempts to hold a lot of meaning in this very short story. There's one thread here that's about Jesus being the best version of Moses. There are 5 dreams and 5 prophecies, like the 5 books of the Torah. And just like Moses, Jesus is saved as an infant from the murdering rage of a tyrant. There's a thread in here about the exile. Ramah was where the people were gathered before deportation. The southern kingdom of Judah contained the tribe of Benjamin, one of Rachel's sons. There's a thread in here about Jesus, in that, unlike Mark and John, Matthew writes to give Jesus an origin, that he didn't just come out of the woods one day, all grown up and ready to die on the cross. Matthew writes his gospel from the very beginning to show us that the life of Jesus, the whole life of Jesus, matters to us, to our lives and how we live them, because our lives matter to God. If we are to model our lives off the life of Jesus, this story is part of where we have to begin. We have to begin with vulnerability. We have to begin with our need for care, with our need for one another. At the same time, Matthew is as terrible a historian as Luke, at least in these early stories. Neither one of these writers are like modern historians like we have them today. Close enough counts for them. But just like Luke's census is based on a true story but wasn't an actual event, the story of the murder of the Holy Innocents also likely didn't happen but was based on a true story. Because Herod was an extremely violent ruler. When he came to power in Jerusalem, he murdered the 46 members of the Sanhedrin. He murdered 2 of his children and 1 of his wives. The particular violence Matthew records might not have happened, but his audience knew Herod's violence. They also knew the violence of the siege of Jerusalem and its fall. The story, as Matthew records it, is disturbing because of how the violence is targeted specifically at children. But we know that children are disproportionately bearing the burdens of war and violent conflict. UNICEF reported in May that more than 50,000 children have been reported killed, injured, or severely malnourished in Gaza since October 2023. So even where the story lacks historical evidence, it still rings true. Violence threatens even the infant Son of God, and the Holy Family must seek refuge. It isn't just Jesus' death that matters, but his whole life, and therefore our whole lives. Matt and I have moved a fair bit in our adulthood. We think we're at about 13 or 15 or something ridiculous like that, into and out of seminary housing, grad school housing, internship, different calls. And there have been these interesting in-between places too. You know, the places that you stay because the new place isn't ready yet, like your friend's couch, your childhood bedroom, and once a renovated chicken coop. We stayed there for 2 weeks during one of the coldest Januaries on record, endlessly grateful for our friends' generosity and care. That was when I ran across this Irish proverb that I treasure. It says, "Under the shelter of others, the people survive." In Luke's gospel, when Mary and Joseph needed a safe place to deliver their child, even when there was no place in town, there was a human-hewn stable and a manger. There was shelter. And now in Matthew's story, when violence threatens somewhere in Egypt, there was shelter for the Holy Family, refuge. And I have to imagine in homes throughout Israel, there were mangers and cradles for nibblings, for friends and infant strangers to sleep until the murderous rage of the powers and principalities once again subsided. Under the shelter of others, the people survive. This is, I think, part of our congregation's commitment to love boldly, part of our inclusive welcome, our ministry of hospitality in our community. We who have been so graciously hosted at this table merrily host others and learn and know and celebrate that. So often in caring for a guest, we discover that we are the ones being changed. We are the ones being cared for and reoriented and drawn more deeply into one another's lives. We find ourselves in a cycle of mutual care that gives meaning to all our lives. Under the shelter of others, the people survive. Beloved, the lives that we're called to as Christians are to be as vulnerable as the Christ child and to receive one another as if we were receiving Christ. We're called to live as people who provide shelter, and we're called to live as people who need shelter. We're called to be a part of the ongoing life of Christ, the life that matters, the life that saves, not just through the cross, not just long ago, but through communities of care, through gracious hospitality, through lives rearranged so that fear does not have the last word. Under the shelter of others, the people survive, and God's life continues to take flesh among us.